It's all about stranded knitting patterns for beginners in this video. We're going to discuss what exactly stranded knitting is, what you should look for in a beginner-friendly pattern, a few pattern recommendations from me, and some recommendations from other knitters too. Hey nerdy knitter, Tanya here. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a master hand knitter, and I believe knitting is a form of self-care. You can take time for yourself and your creative hobbies like knitting and create beautiful garments that you love to wear. And one of those types of garments are garments with stranded knitting. And we're going to discuss what exactly that means, what stranded knitting is. And then we'll also look at what you should look for in a first pattern if you're just getting started. There are some things that are probably easier to do for beginners, and we're going to discuss those things you can look for in a pattern. I have a few pattern recommendations of my own, including my first stranded knitting project, and also some recommendations from other knitters. I asked what their first project was when it came to stranded knitting, and there were lots of recommendations. I'm only going to share a few of them, but I'll also link to that discussion so you can go see what other recommendations were listed as well. Before we get to the patterns, what exactly is stranded knitting? Well, stranded knitting fits within the category of color work knitting. And the other category would be like textured knitting, where you're using things like cables or lace or knit and purl combinations to create patterns using texture. The other option is to use various yarn colors using a color work method to create a pattern on your garment. So within this color work category, there are different ways you can use these different colors of yarn to create that project. You can use stranded knitting, mosaic knitting, two color or more color, slip stitch knitting, intarsia. There's lots of ways to create a pattern using color. For stranded knitting specifically, you're going to start with two colors at least. A lot of patterns will use many more colors. You'll probably just be using two colors in one round. Sometimes there will be more than two colors in a round, but for basic patterns, you're going to have at least two colors because you need the different colors to create the pattern. Now, in something like mosaic knitting, even though you're creating a colored pattern, you're only using one color at a time. So you're knitting certain stitches and slipping certain stitches while you're using that one color. The end of the row or the round, you drop that color, you pick up the next color, and you repeat the process. The difference with stranded knitting is you're holding those two yarns or perhaps more, and you are using them on each round. You're not using just one color. You're holding two colors at least and stranding the one that's not being used at that time across the back. So let's say your chart is most often going to be charted, but you might find patterns with written instructions as well. But this is a good time to learn how to use charts because it shows you a picture of what you're trying to create with your knitting. Let's say your chart tells you to knit the first 3 stitches with color A. So you're knitting with color A and you're holding color B as well. And then the next 5 stitches are color B. So while you're knitting with color B, you're holding color A and it's creating a strand across the back of the work, or a float as it's often referred to. And that's where we get the term stranded knitting. Those strands or those floats of the other yarn that's not being used is being carried along the back of the work. And it's actually very beautiful. Even the wrong side of the work where you can see all those floats and those strands can be just as beautiful as the front where you see the pattern. Many different regions and countries use stranded knitting techniques. One very popular region would be Fair Isle, which is an area of the Shetland Islands in Scotland. Now, this is one thing I'm going to be a little nitpicky about. A lot of people use the terms Fair Isle knitting and stranded knitting to mean the same thing. They don't mean the same thing. If we go back to the beginning where we talked about these categories of knitting, you have your textured patterns like cables and lace. You have your color work like stranded knitting, mosaic, slip stitch, and tarja. So within stranded knitting, we have Fair Isle knitting, which if you've ever seen Fair Isle sweaters, it's bands of geometric designs, often with muted colors, and everything sort of has this soft blended look to it. That's very different from like a Scandinavian sweater where it might be very high contrast, like a navy blue paired with white yarn and just two colors instead of the multiple colors you'll see in Fair Isle. But they're both stranded knitting. They both use the technique of holding one yarn while you're working the other and then switching. It's stranding that second unused color while you're working your row or your round. So you'll find stranded knitting is used in a lot of places for a lot of different designs. There's like the Icelandic Lopi sweaters, which are totally different than Fair Isle sweaters and Norwegian sweaters. or the bohus yoke sweaters, or selbu mittens. Like there's lots of ways that stranded knitting is used to create very unique and beautiful designs, but they're not all fair isle. Fair isle is a subset of stranded knitting. I just want to drive that point home because they should not be used interchangeably. Even though all these different regions and geographical locations use the basics of stranded knitting, it's done in completely different ways in different places. You're going to use different yarns. Like if you're knitting a Lopi sweater from Iceland, you might want to use an Icelandic yarn. If you're knitting a Fair Isle sweater, you might want to use a Shetland yarn. Color choice is going to be different depending on the different locations. The motifs and designs and patterns that are used will be different. Even the construction methods for the garments or the projects will be different from one location to another, but the basics are the same. They're using one color and holding the other one, and then switching colors and holding the other one and creating floats or strands across the back of the work. Even something like color dominance, that's something you're going to see in Fair Isle patterns where they hold the yarns in specific ways so one color remains more dominant than the other. But you're not going to see that in other places that use stranded knitting. So a lot of people will say, yes, color dominance is a thing, and then other knitters will say, no, it's not. It's actually regional. It's an important part of Fair Isle knitting, but it might not be so important for other types of stranded knitting depending on the different region. So I know that was a lot of information just to understand what stranded knitting is, but I think it's an important thing to understand what it is and why it's different in different places and why you're going to see people argue about things like color dominance. It's because different areas have different rules about how they do stranded knitting. Nothing is wrong or right. It's just that's how they're done in certain places. But now we can move on to the next step. If you're choosing your first project, what should you look for? Now, the first thing I like to look for in a beginner pattern is one that uses just two colors. That way you're not having to juggle multiple balls of yarn and you can just focus on all of the techniques, like how you're going to hold the yarn. Are you going to worry about color dominance and all the different things, weaving in all the yarn tails, carrying your floats? There's a lot that you have to figure out while you're working stranded knitting. So to make things simple, pick a pattern that only uses just two colors. But if what draws you to stranded knitting is all of the different colors, then instead what you could do instead of using lots of different colors, choose one yarn that has all the colors, like either like gradient yarn or a variegated yarn. Pair that with a complementary solid color so you can still get the fun of all the color without having to deal with all of the balls of yarn. And you still have just two balls of yarn, but lots of color. Now, the second thing I would say is important is to pick a pattern that is like maybe a DK or a worsted weight. It's not really essential, but when you're learning how you want to hold the yarn, you can hold them both in your left hand, both in your right hand, one in each hand. You want to practice those different ways, and it's easier to do if the yarn's a little bit thicker and the needles are a little bit bigger. The finer the yarn, the thinner the needles, the harder it is to practice those techniques. So perhaps look for a pattern that uses a DK or a worsted weight yarn. I like to start with a small project like a hat or a cowl, something that will fit on a 16-inch circular needle. I don't really love smaller circumferences because then while you're learning those techniques, you're also dealing with double pointed needles or magic loop or whatever method that you like for knitting small circumferences in the round. But of course, a sweater can be overwhelming because that's just a lot of knitting. So a small project, but still the circumference is big enough so it will fit on a 16-inch circular. And that leads me right to the next point. I would choose a pattern that is done in the round because then the knits are always facing you and you can focus on the basic techniques. Now, a lot of the time stranded knitting projects are just done in the round, but not always. You will find them knit flat as well. But learning to look at the pattern and purl in this stranded method can be just as difficult to learn. So I think it's better to focus on knitting in the round, getting the knit stitches down and understanding how you want to hold the yarns before you tackle trying to do stranded knitting flat. Now, if possible, choose a design that uses short floats. So those are those sections of yarn that are stranded along the wrong side of the work. When you're using one color, the other color is being carried along behind, creating that float. The longer that float, the more likely it is you're going to make everything a little too tight and you get puckers. Everything like sucks in because you didn't let that float hang out and get really loose. And the more stitches you have of one color in a row, the longer that float for the other color. So to start out with, choose a pattern that has really short floats. So if you can, look at the picture of the garment and see, is there a section where you're using one color for a really long row? then you're either going to have a very long strand of the other color, or you're going to have to learn to catch your floats, which is something important to learn. But you can probably forget that for your first project if you choose a project that has very short floats and you don't have to worry about catching yarn. You can just get used to the rhythm of doing stranded knitting. So those are the guidelines I like to follow when I'm selecting a pattern for somebody who's new to stranded knitting. But I have one more tip as well, and that would be realize that this first project or even first few projects with stranded knitting are not going to be perfect. You are learning a lot of new skills all at once. How to read and follow a stranded knitting chart, how to hold all those yarns, maybe how to catch the floats. There's so much to learn in this process, so just give yourself a little bit of grace and realize that first project is not going to be perfect, but it will be a learning experience, and in the future you'll look back and appreciate the things you learned with that first project. Now it's time for the fun part. We're going to look at some patterns. So we're going to look at my screen and look at a few patterns that I recommend, as well as some recommendations from other knitters too. So first is this one. This is the November cowl, and it actually goes along with the next one. I've got two. These are my designs. This is the Longshore Currents cowl. Now both of these are stranded knitting, and it's done lengthwise, where you are starting in the round and working your cowl lengthwise this way, binding off, and then you're sewing the cast on and bind off edges together. So you never see like where all the floats are. They're all hidden inside in your cowl. But this is just using two colors. This one, the November cowl, uses worsted weight yarn, and the Longshore Currents cowl uses fingering weight yarn. So I kind of am breaking my own rule there about using a bigger yarn. But this yarn is fun because it's a gradient yarn. So you get all of the fun of the colors without having to change colors. It just uses two colors. We have one gradient paired with a complementary solid color. So you can see with this one, we've got black paired with this fun sort of rainbow color. And then this one has shades of blue paired with white. So just two colors, but you still get all of the fun. And you're just doing your stranded knitting techniques, and you're also going to learn how to sew up the ends together to finish your cowl. So the yarn for both of these is Knit Picks Chroma, which is a beautiful gradient yarn, lots of great colors. So I like it when I want to do stranded knitting, but I want to keep it simple and just have two yarns. There's also a knit along coming up in November if you're watching this when this video is released, where we're going to knit either the November cowl or the Longshore Currents cowl. You can choose which one, and we'll have some live streams and discuss all the different stranded knitting methods and techniques that you need to know, and have some fun giveaways. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I'll put a link down to the Nerdy Knitting community and you can check it out. My next recommendation is for the pattern that I used for my first stranded knitting project, and that would be from Very Pink Knits, her Learn to Knit Fair hat, which uses a worsted weight yarn, just two colors, and it's one simple band. You just have the hat as your background basically, and then you're doing this band of color work on the hat. Now what's really nice about this is all of these videos that are included that walk you through all of the process and have lots of different techniques and tips to help you with your Fair Isle journey. My final recommendation would be for the Clayoquot Toque from Tin Can Knits. Try to say that 5 times fast. I've had to repeat that multiple times just to get it correct. But this one is really a beautiful hat. It does have 3 colors instead of 2, but you're only ever using 2 colors in one round. So it's still, I would say, beginner friendly. And their patterns are always very well written. It comes in lots of different sizes. It's DK weight yarn, 7 sizes. And it also, I love down here in the details, it has blog posts and articles on their website that walk you through a lot of the techniques that are important. So if you, instead of video, prefer written instructions, then the Tin Can Knits patterns are great because they always have wonderful, helpful articles that go along with their patterns. Now we're going to look at your pattern recommendations. I asked about your first stranded knitting projects, and these are some of the patterns that you shared with me. There were a lot more patterns that were shared, but this would be a really long video if I shared all of them. But I'll link to that original conversation so you can go see what other recommendations were listed as well. But the first one here is the Boreal Mitts by Jill Wick. Now Mayebola says, Boreal Mitts by Jill Wick, and yes, I absolutely recommend it as a first stranded knitting project. It goes super fast because it's Aran weight. And if you have to unravel a couple of times, it's still pretty much instant satisfaction. Also, since it doesn't take much yarn, it's easy to use your stash, and you can hold lighter yarns double or triple to get gauge. So these are really Very pretty mitts, 3 colors, but again, you're only using 2 colors at a time. Oh, I like the yarn she used, is very fuzzy. Those look like they'd be very nice and warm. Very simple geometric design. So 3 colors, 2 sizes, women's small and medium, uses Aran weight yarn. It's a free pattern. So if you're new to knitting mittens as well, you'll also learn how to do thumb gussets. So that's another good thing. Then we have the Baa-ble hat by Donna Smith. Raquel says, mine was the Baa-ble hat and it was great. A hat is less tragic if you have to frog and reknit a few rows, which I did more than once. It also is only 2 colors per row in a worsted weight and works up very cute. So I was motivated to keep going. And it is very, very cute pattern. I've knit this one as well. And it does, I mean, there's more colors as you can see here, but you're only still, I believe, only using 2 colors on around. There might be maybe some in there. I don't think so, maybe. It's just the black and the white. Somewhere around the sheep you might have other colors, but it's still pretty simple pattern and it is very cute. So this one only comes in 1 size, but there are instructions for adjusting the size, worsted Aran weight yarn, and it is 4 Great British pounds. Now the next recommendation is for Anthology, another one from Tin Can Knits. Courtney says, I did the Tin Can Knits Anthology hat, which is kind of a choose your own adventure colorwork hat. I liked that it was free and a hat, so when I had to rip out most of it to actually fit my daughter's big head, it wasn't a big deal. However, as my first colorwork, I probably would have liked more direction regarding color choice and motif choice. So yes, this one is part of their, I think it's Strange Brew is the name, where you knit a colorwork sweater. But you choose, it is like sort of a choose your own adventure. You choose the colors you want and you choose the motifs that you want to include. Now, this is one of those as well. This is a hat and a cowl, and it is that choose your own adventure style. You use whatever yarn you'd like. There are 3 different gauges. You choose the stitch patterns that you want to plug in there, and they have, all of them are included. So you just sort of pick and choose the ones that you want for your hat and your cowl, and you can see all of these examples here using their method. All this different stitch patterns you can include and how it can look. So this one comes in 5 hat sizes, 3 regular cowl sizes, and then 4 tubular cowl sizes. So lots of pattern in here, multiple yarn weights, and it's also a free pattern. So this would be a really good one if you like the idea of choosing the stitch patterns yourself and sort of plug and play with them. The next recommendation comes from Giselle. She says, my first stranded colorwork project was the pattern We Call Them Pirates. It's a free project on Ravelry. It's done in the round, so gives good practice of doing colorwork in the round. Also has a few rows where the floats are long enough to also practice catching them, and small enough that you can finish and see how the colorwork tension blocks out in the finished object. I gifted it to my brother and he loved it until he accidentally shrunk it. Ouch, oh no. He has asked me to knit him another one to replace the first one. So, oh yeah, accidentally shrinking is terrible, but you know he loved it if he wants another one. So yes, this is a very cute hat. It has this really fun sort of like skull and crossbone piratey. I really like the way this is very cute hat. It comes in 1 size. It uses sport weight yarn, and like she said, it's a free pattern. It's very cute. Then we have the Voyageurs Beanie pattern by Nancy Bates. This is part of her Knitting the National Parks book. This is one of the patterns in there, and I think it's so cute. Now this one adds a little bit of texture as well, but comment first. The Voyageurs hat from Knitting the National Parks by Nancy Bates. My first attempt at reading a chart and color work. Proud of my work. A few wonky islands, but done. But yeah, I don't think any would ever notice if you had a few wonky islands because they all kind of look a little wonky. They look very neat. What I like about this is it includes some texture. So it's just 2 colors again, one for your background, and then your islands are that beautiful green, and they are done in seed stitch to add some texture to it as well. So this one comes in 1 size for an average adult head. It uses worsted weight yarn and it's $5 US. Or if there's lots of her hats that you like in this collection, then just get the book. The whole book looks really lovely. The next recommendation is from Patricia. She says Persian Dreams by Jenise Hope. It's a large blanket knitted in fingering weight yarn. I had just taught myself to knit using YouTube and saw this. I loved it and had to make it. What a way to learn colorwork. Took me 5 years to complete. So yes, I am not sure I would recommend fingering weight blanket as your first stranded knitting project. But you know, sometimes you are motivated because you really want that item, and that's just a really good reason to learn to do something because you just want the thing that you're going to have at the end. But in general, yeah, a fingering weight blanket is a big project. But that design is so popular, and it's on my wish list to do someday as well, She also has a worsted weight version of it. So if you love this blanket, I'm not saying I recommended it for a beginner, but Patricia loves it, even though it took her 5 years to finish. Yeah, blankets take a long time. Those are more of my, like, I like to do once in a while, kind of a bit of a blanket. But whew, anyway, there is a worsted weight version of it, and it is lovely. Like, it's just such a pretty design. So you're doing this one in pieces. There are different individual hexagons. You start in the center, so that's another skill you might have to learn. And then you're working in the round to finish each hexagon. And then as they're complete, you can either graft them or sew them together. So lots of good skills to learn here, but it is definitely a big project to tackle. So it's available in worsted and fingering weight. There are different variations of this, and the worsted weight version is $8 Canadian. And then Antisocial Auntie recommends this one. I'm doing my first stranded knit project now. It's the Dragon Tail Cowl by Hunt Hand Knits. Having two charts inverse of each other has been helpful because trying to remember the dark blocks was supposed to be my light color might have been too much to remember for my first one. Almost half done and has been fun to knit. It is beautiful. This is just a beautifully detailed cowl. And I agree with you. If you're having to do like an inverse of the colors, I would want two charts as well. That would be very confusing for me as well. But it's really, I just think it's just lovely. And I do like how they have inverted the colors, and you can see what the difference, like, they're the same pattern, but they look so different depending on which color is your pattern and which one is your background. So really lovely pattern. This one is one size, uses a DK weight yarn, just two colors. It's an intricate design, but it is very beautiful and is $6 US. I'd love to hear about your experience with stranded knitting. Have you done a stranded knitting project before? How was that process for you? And do you have a pattern recommendation for other beginner knitters? And if you're looking for pattern recommendations, be sure to go check out those comments. I'm also going to link to the original thread where we discussed this so you can see what other patterns were recommended, because I just didn't have the time to share them all here, but there were a lot of great ones. And if you want to continue hanging out with me, I'll let YouTube recommend a video and put it right here. And I'll see you in the next video.